Good morning and welcome. Thank you for joining us. This is CASBO's webinar on the Governor's 2025-26 budget proposal, often called the Governor's Budget, or GB for short. You will hear from CASBO's leaders on Governor Newsom's plan and priorities. This budget is the first step in a long process that will culminate with a final budget negotiated with the legislature in June. CASBO's GR team and the legislative committee will be engaged in this process and will keep you informed at key junctures along the way. I'm Sara Pietrowski, CASBO's Chief Governmental Relations Officer, and shortly my co-presenters will introduce themselves. A few notes before we begin. As a reminder to all attendees, this webinar is being recorded, and all registered attendees will receive a link to the recording as well as a copy of the slides. If you have questions, please direct them to the Q&A. This will help us follow up with any questions we are unable to answer today. If you are joining us via the YouTube live stream, staff is monitoring the chat, but please email any unanswered questions to the address that you saw on the first slide. I will turn it over to Eric Dill.
Thank you, Sara, and good morning, everyone. I'm Eric Dill, Assistant Superintendent of Business Services for Carlsbad Unified School District, and I am the CASBO President for 24-25.
Good morning. I am Mark Schiel, Deputy Superintendent and Chief Business Officer for Santa Clara Unified School District and Chair of CASBO's Legislative Committee.
Good morning. I'm Laura Lilley. I'm the Senior Director of District Business Services at the Placer County Office of Education, and I'm currently the Legislative Committee Assistant Chair.
Okay, so we're going to dive into the details of the governor's budget proposal. As Sara mentioned, this proposal that came out on Friday is a very high-level summary of the governor's proposals, and the details will come out as the proposal is introduced into the legislature through a variety of bills, and we will watch all of the committee hearings. We will participate in those. We'll also be engaged with legislators and staff as the budget makes its way through the legislature to the May revise and ultimately to the final signed budget act that you'll see later this year. So, the devil is in the details, and there are some things that still remain to be seen. Just to answer probably the first 8 questions that have come up in the chat, yes, we will be sharing the slide deck that will be coming out shortly. And you'll see that message repeated throughout. We will be sharing this information. So overall, I hate to say that this is a boring budget, but because last time I said that was in 2020, and just 2 months later, the world was shut down and we didn't know what was going to happen with the state budget. But this is pretty straightforward, and what we're noticing in terms of themes is there's not a lot of new requirements and new programs that are proposed in the budget, except for a few which we will be addressing. So the most important thing for us is what is the Prop 98 funding level for 25-26, and you see the number at just under 119 billion on the screen. Mark's going to give you some detail in the next slide, but depending on how you look at that number, it's either a slight increase, flat, or a slight drop. And there's a few different ways that you can look at it, and Mark will talk about why we're not exactly sure whether this is a slight increase or a slight drop. The governor was really focusing on a balanced budget and just building on a stable and steady economy. But there are risks, as there always are with the budget proposal, and those certainly come from the volatile revenue stream that comes from capital gains as billionaires reap the benefits of Wall Street, and they have different times when they can determine when they want to pay their tax. And so with the volatility of the stock market and with just how the tax structure works, that can lead to some uncertainty in the budget, and the governor addressed that. There's also concern about the change in the federal administration and what could that potentially mean, not only for education funding coming to the state of California, but overall federal funding coming to the state. So there's certainly some unknowns with how things are going to play out over the next 1 to 4 years, and so that I think has caused the governor some pause as well. And then finally, and our hearts go out to all those who are affected by the fires in Los Angeles County. This is an unprecedented disaster in our state, and that certainly will have some economic impact, both on the state and the overall economy. And so as that remains to be seen how that will play out for this year's revenue and next, that is certainly something that we're going to have to keep our eye on, and certainly the Department of Finance and the State Controller's Office are watching that as well. And so we could see some changes by the time we get to the May revise on the estimate for revenue over the 3-year budget cycle.
Thank you, Eric. As the governor said during his press conference, he reminded us of the nearly $29 billion in key investments that have been made to core programs for education, including learning recovery, learning loss mitigation, community schools, special education, educator workforce, as well as the children and youth behavioral health supports that have also been put in place. And that is in the past. What are we looking at as we move forward? In the January governor's budget proposal, he indicated that for the 23-24 fiscal year, Prop 98 comes in at $98.5 billion. It's test 2 year, and as we know, it was suspended. We are not going to go back into the suspension and how we ended up there. For the current, based upon current information, for 2024-25, it would be $119.2 billion, and it would be a test 1 year. And for 2025-26, it would also be a test 1 year, and as Eric stated, just under $119 billion. We also indicated, or as Eric said and teased it out a little bit, that's either slightly up for 25-26, it's flat, or it's less. The governor stated in his January budget proposal appropriating for the 2024-25 year $117.6 billion. Because of the volatility that is currently impacting the state based upon various factors as outlined by Eric. As school business professionals, we can look at this a couple different ways. One way is recognizing that there is volatility to this situation, that he is concerned about over appropriating, and when we are in all of our individual districts, we are also worried about overspending and spending with resources that maybe we don't have available to us. So in some regards, we can applaud the conservative nature. He did say in his press conference that he will continue to analyze this and will be making revisions to his budget proposal at the May revision. For CASBO's sake, we will continue to keep an eye on this. We certainly will not be supporting anything that would not support Proposition 98, and we would want to ensure that the full amount owed to schools is actually and ultimately appropriated, and that this does not become precedent setting. And so while we understand that there are many concerns that are out there, know that we as CASBO and our legislative committee will be keeping a very close eye on this. The guarantee is rebenched in the test 1 years, and that is to ensure that we are at that 39.6%, and it is indicated in there that it has been rebenched in order to ensure in those test 1 years that we are meeting that statutory requirement.
And if I'll just jump in and say, many of our partners and sister agencies across the state are very concerned about that lower amount that the governor has put out. And, just as the CASBO president, I'll reiterate and reinforce what Mark has said. We are hoping that, should the numbers pan out at that higher amount at 119 or higher, that the governor will recognize that, and that all monies due to school districts under Prop 98 will be paid, and that this is not another maneuver. It's not a gimmick. It's just some cautious budgeting in the face of uncertainty, and we certainly hope that that's the case. And then I just wanted to comment, since we are talking about Test 2 and Test 1, with the suspension of Prop 98 in 23-24, that did create a maintenance factor to level up funding in a future year. But those payments are only made in a Test 2 year. And so since revenue has not increased to the amount that would allow for payment on the maintenance factor for dollars that that were unfortunately not provided to schools this year, we don't know when we will see that, but it won't be until we hit that Test 2 environment. And there are folks that can explain that much better than I can. ChatGPT actually does a really good job too, if you'd ever like to know how Test 1, Test 2, Test 3 works for Prop 98. But as of right now, we don't see any progress towards restoration of the maintenance factor to get us back into closer to where we would have been under Test 2 if it had not been suspended.
The governor goes on to explain Prop 98 general fund spending indicates that it has increased over the 3-year period by over $7.5 billion relative to the 2024 Budget Act, and that total funding of $137.1 billion for all K-12 programming due to continued declining enrollment within the state. And that is inclusive of TK, but due to the continued declining enrollment, per pupil funding remains relatively stable. And you can see on the screen that within Prop 98 alone, just over $18,900 per student in Prop 98 funding. This is the graph that we show within each one of our presentations showing Prop 98 funding over the last several years. And again, you can see that 2023-24 amount at $98.5 billion, increasing to 119, and then that slight decrease to 118.9 in 2025-26. And again, he is included in his budget proposal at that lower amount in 2024-25, but we are articulating that Test 1 should be at that 119.2 billion. And so we will continue to keep an eye on this, as Eric had previously stated. Lastly, in regards to our Prop 98 rainy day fund, you can see that $1.2 billion was in the 2024-25 revised budget, including mandatory payments, and an additional amount of $376 million being deposited in 2025-26, resulting in total reserves of about $1.5 billion. And he does indicate that at the $1.2 billion amount for 2024-25, that would not trigger the Proposition 2 school district reserve caps, and they would also not be re-triggered in 2025-26 as well. And so you can see where we would be with our rainy day funds. With that, I will turn it over to Laura, and she will give a little bit more details specifically in regards to the local control funding formula. Laura?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Okay, it seems like it was not that long ago, but hard to believe, just last first interims to our boards. And likely you use the current year enacted budget COLA for 25-26, which was estimated at 2.93. We're now seeing the COLA for 25-26 is projecting to be 2.43%, so it's gone down a little bit. The governor's proposing that will cost about $2.5 billion to fully fund that COLA, along with any adjustments for population growth. Just a reminder on the LCFF COLA, we do need those 8 data points in order to come up with the COLA. So we are still shy of all those data points. We'll get our final one in April. So be looking forward to that. We were excited to see that the governor is also proposing to apply that COLA to some other categoricals outside of the LCFF, excuse me. And we've listed some of those on the slide. But in addition to special ed, school nutrition, and the mandate block grant proposed, the proposal includes COLA for the equity multiplier, for state preschool, foster care program, adults and correctional programs, charter school facilities grant program, American Indian centers, and the American Indian Early Childhood Education program. We have some good news for deferrals. The proposed budget fully repays all of those budget deferrals. in the budget year 25-26. The second bullet here outlines some of the minor adjustments that were to the budget deferrals and some reappropriations in 23-24, but effectively ends that full repayment in 24-25. So we think the key takeaway here really is no new budget deferrals. Everything's getting retired in 25-26. So projecting and managing your cash flow should be a little bit simpler for those that with that task going forward.
If I could just jump in, because I did see somebody comment in the Q&A about the COLA. The 2.43% is for the 25-26 school year, not 24-25. So don't count on COLA higher than the 1.7%, the 0.7% that we had. The 2.43 is for next year, not this year.
Thank you. Thanks, Eric. Okay, moving on to Universal Transitional Kindergarten. You might recall 25-26 is the final year of the four-year UTK rollout. So we'll be at full implementation in the budget year. But before we jump into budget year, let's take a look at our current year, 24-25, and kind of see where we ended up with respect to that. A $1.5 billion was included of ongoing Prop 98 dollars for year 3 of our TK expansion in this current year. And we included our students that are turning 5, 4-year-olds turning 5 between September 2nd and June 2nd this year. In addition to the ongoing age shift dollars, we received $516 million of ongoing dollars to support the additional certificated and classified staff for those TK classrooms. Now looking ahead to 25-26 and the proposal, reminder again, this is our 4th year fully implemented in 25-26. So that TK eligibility date is moving up. So it'll be all students turning 4 by September 1st. That equates to about $2.4 billion of ongoing Prop 98 dollars to support those additional students who we're now required to enroll. You might remember in 25-26, we also have the student to teacher class ratios. We have that mandate that we need to move from 12-1 down to 10-1 in all our TK classrooms. So we were very glad to see included in this budget some additional dollars equaling $1.5 billion to support those increased costs of that required staffing ratios for us. You know, we do have some questions as to how that was calculated, that's truly going to be the cost to us. And we hope that it's sufficient to cover what those costs will be of those additional staff that we need, and that we can actually hire the staff and avoid any penalties that will be, because now full implementation, there will be penalties if we don't meet those requirements of TK. So we're keeping our eye on that going forward. And I think it's turned over to Eric for expanded learning.
Thank you. So what we hope is good news here, and I think a number of districts will be pleased with this proposal. There is a proposal to lower the threshold for the Tier 1 funding level from 75% unduplicated pupil count to 55%. So just as a reminder, there's a 2-tier structure for funding, and Tier 1 being the higher of the 2. This is a legacy program for the current governor, and the legislature has overwhelmingly supported ELOP. So they wanted to funnel more dollars. They're providing or proposing to provide another $435 million to that in order to implement this change to lower the Tier 1 threshold to 55%. What we haven't seen is if that comes at the expense of Tier 2. And so what we're hoping to see is that the rising tide will lift all boats, that we will see no decrease in the Tier 2 funding level in order to implement this higher. We believe that the 435 is simply to provide that higher funding level for more school districts. In the current year, it was about a $700 swing between Tier 1 and Tier 2. So those of you with the 55 to 74% unduplicated count, start figuring out what that could potentially mean, and stay tuned for more information as these funding levels become clear in the proposed budget. Moving on to the discretionary block grant. I like that our slide here just calls it discretionary block grant. The full name of it is Student Support and Professional Development Discretionary Block Grant. And just like the Arts, Music, and Instructional Materials Discretionary Block Grant, last year I said ignore its first name, its last name is discretionary. And so this is good news for us as another tranche of one-time money coming to school districts should this proposal survive, that will provide funds to first address rising costs. And I think they put that in air quotes in the proposal, to address rising costs, which to me means everything, because everything costs more than it did before. And so districts can take a look at these dollars and see where they might help with just any number of things that have cost us more throughout the last few years. There was some intent language or priority language for English language arts development, PD on math framework, and then also to encourage teacher recruitment and retention. I think we all know what that's a code word for. Again, I say address rising costs in there. What the governor is doing here is following a practice that goes back to the Brown administration, where we would get one-time discretionary block grant dollars with a lot of language attached to it, so that the administration could take credit for providing funding to us for a number of things. So if we went to him and said, hey, we need money to help us with the cost of AB 218 settlements, we gave you money for that. We need dollars for the CTE framework that's coming out. They gave us dollars for that. We need money for PD for mathematics framework. We gave you money for that. It's all in that discretionary block grant, but you can only spend it once because it's one-time dollars. So, make your decisions locally on the best way to move forward. We don't have any indication quite yet on what the allocation method will be for the discretionary block grant. So we don't know if there's going to be a weighting factor or exactly how those dollars will come to us until we see introduction of the bill into the legislature. If we were to do a straight ADA calculation, it'd be a little over $300 per ADA statewide, but don't quote me on that number because I don't know that that's real or not yet. You'll certainly be seeing that number when there's more specificity on the allocation model. So moving on to the master plan for career education, there is another proposal to add additional dollars, really at the statewide level, to implement a new plan for CTE, which would consolidate programs and create a new pathway, including articulation between K-12 and the community college districts. And so, we still want to see exactly how that's going to play out. But again, when you look at the budget proposal, the governor said you could use your discretionary dollars to help implement the costs for expanding career pathways or to expand dual enrollment, working with your community college districts. So that might be the funding source that they're looking for that would come with this. I personally like the effort that is going on to consolidate the many different CTE grants that are out there right now to create just one coherent CTE funding stream. And we'll certainly be watching to see how that works its way through the legislature.
And Eric, one of the things that I would like to say in regards to this is the intentionality that the governor said in his report also about telling CDE that they need to combine the applications as well and compress that into one application as opposed to having all of these different applications out there for the CTE funding, which kind of goes back to what we've been saying as CASBO last year, going into our reporting requirements. Multiple applications also increases that administrative burden as well. And so this will have a positive benefit on our school district administratively.
All right. Next up, we have literacy instruction. The administration has been focused on supporting and improving literacy instruction over the past 6 years. This has included investments in the implementation of the English language arts, English language development framework, the literacy roadmap, literacy coaches. This work is really happening against a backdrop of a national push for the adoption of the science of reading, which is really about how much phonics is included in reading instruction. So here we have the investments for this area. Building on some of these prior investments, this budget includes 500 million one-time Prop 98 general fund for TK-12 mathematics and literacy coaches. This expands the existing literacy coaches and reading specialist grant program, but for the first time adds mathematics coaches into the mix. This funding is targeted to our highest poverty schools. There's also 40 million one-time Prop 98 general fund for the purchase of materials and training related to the new reading difficulty screener requirement for grades K-12 that begins in the 2025-26 school year. This is in addition to the 25 million one-time Prop 98 general fund that was allocated for this purpose last year. There's also 5 million Prop 98 annually through the 2029-2030 fiscal year to create a literacy network within the California statewide system of support. The targeted activities here are a clearinghouse for state literacy resources, elevating high-performing districts and practices, and supporting LEAs who are facing persistent literacy challenges. And finally, there's also 300,000 in non-98 general fund for the Instructional Quality Commission to develop a curriculum guide and resources for the new personal finance course requirement that passed in legislation last year. Next, we're going to move on to teacher preparation and professional development. California, as you all know, has been impacted by educator shortages for a number of years now. And unfortunately, a recent report from the Commission on Teacher Credentialing doesn't indicate that there's going to be a change in this pattern anytime soon. Some of the most recent data available from the 2022-23 school year shows that there was a 10.6% decrease in the number of new credentials issued, and newly enrolled teacher candidates decreased by 11.7% from the prior year. So to support efforts to turn this tide, the administration is proposing 2 investments to support teachers and improve access to the educator pipeline. First, there's 150 million one-time Prop 98 general fund for a new teacher recruitment incentive grant. The budget summary was really light on details here, so we will look towards the budget trailer bill release to understand a little bit more about that program. Second, there's 100 million one-time Prop 98 general fund proposed to extend the timeline for the participation in the National Board Certification Program, which has been a focus of the administration over the past couple of years. I would finally note that the budget does not restore last year's cut to the Golden State Teacher Grant Program.
What I will say is, in our advocacy, we often point out that the best teacher recruitment tool that the state can provide us is consistent funding for public education. When it is not necessarily a problem of the preparation programs that we don't have applicants. It is that in times when school districts are not hiring new teachers, or in times when they may be reducing staff, young people do not see a career forward in education, and so they pursue other opportunities. We need to show that this is a viable lifelong career path for people who are interested in education, because if we lose them when they're in the 18 to 22-year-olds, we never get them back. And if they complete a credential program and then find themselves out on the street 1 or 2 years later, we often never get those people back. They find other careers and they don't return to public education after having to go through that trauma of losing their job. So the most important thing is that we have vibrant, vigorous, robust funding for public education in California if we want to make sure that we've got a clear pipeline of people that want to pursue teaching.
So the last topic that we will cover today is in regards to school facilities. And it's important to note that there is no proposed additional funding in the governor's budget proposal for K-12 facilities. outside of Proposition 2. And we would like to thank California voters for passing Proposition 2 last November, which will provide more than $8.5 billion in funding through the state's general obligation bonds for K-12 schools. And you can see that more than $4 billion of that goes to modernization projects, $3 billion for new construction, and then there's also additional allocated funding for charter schools and career technical education programs. It wasn't clearly articulated within the executive summary that was published, but subsequent to that, we did hear that it is the budget proposal's intent on issuing $1.5 billion in TK through 12 general obligation bonds during fiscal year 2025-2026. That's important because those resources will be necessary for many of our school districts who will be seeking reimbursement for projects currently underway or future projects as well. I do want to spend a moment to remind you of the new requirements in Proposition 2 in order to access these funds. There are 3 documents that you will need to have created. One is a facilities master plan. 2 is what is known as an educational specifications document. That document articulates what facilities you need in order to meet your educational needs within your district. And the 3rd is a 5-year facilities master plan, a little bit more detailed of what you will be doing over the next 5 years, as opposed to a 20 or 30-year facilities master plan as well. And so if you have goals and a priority of being able to access that Proposition 2 money, I would encourage you to begin starting the process of those 3 documents and determining what your next steps are in that regard. With that, we will turn it over to our key takeaways and next steps for our budget. And the first is the governor is clearly focused on fiscal stability, not only and definitely at that statewide level, and wanting to make sure. And when we were talking about this before today's meeting, we were also talking about that right now there is no new programs being introduced or proposed for the governor's budget proposal. And I think that is key for us, is this is the first time in a while that a January budget proposal doesn't contain a new requirement. And I shared when we were saying I went home that night and I didn't go home that night thinking, how are we going to implement something in the next 6 months? And I think that is one of the good takeaways that we had that came out of this January budget proposal. Team, anything else for you? Key takeaways?
No, I think you hit it, Mark. Yeah, just looking at, there are some Q&As of some things that perhaps we could address here. First, I've been watching the comments on ELOP, and frankly, we'd like to be able to use those dollars in a less restrictive way, and perhaps to expand learning opportunities during the school day. But the program is what it is, and probably nobody has brought this up to members of the legislature and to the administration more than me, that I would like to see some changes to that, but it's not going to happen. So take the dollars and find creative ways to use them within the allowable ways that you can use those dollars, especially if now you're going to be the beneficiary of that lower threshold. In looking at Grant Schimmelfenning's question about, is there any indication of what could potentially change from here to May? I think probably the thought would be, one, if the COLA is lower, they could just fund the statutory COLA, and then that would be lower revenue for everyone out there if they were just to stick to statutory COLA and LCFF. The other would be they could look at that one-time discretionary block grant as another area where they could potentially reduce that. To me, those are the 2 big areas. And then the last thing that I'd like to mention is I realized that we didn't touch on the Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant in our presentation. If you recall, 2 years ago, we received allocation letters for that block grant. It was fairly large, and then it was proposed to be cut mid-year. And by the time we were at second interim, we were building in a pretty substantial cut to that block grant in the current year. Ultimately, the full cut did not happen. And when it was restored up to about 90% of its original allocation, there was a pinky swear that the legislature and the governor would fund us beginning in 25, 26 and 26, 27. So this is making good on that promise to provide the rest of the funding. And that is going to come with some additional requirements in future years. So we'll put more information out on that as it makes its way through the legislature.
Eric, I'm also interested in that in the form of those now that emergency block grant money now needs to be in an LCAP and how those timelines will work out. So I'm glad we're keeping an eye on that.
Yeah,
Sure.
somebody from a county office definitely would be interested in that, Laura.
Yeah. Mark, I think there were some questions if you would say those 3 documents again that are required for your prep.
Yeah, those 3 documents. One is a long-range facility master plan for your facilities within your district. A second is an educational specifications document. And then the third being a shorter 5-year facilities master plan.
Are we through the questions? Are we ready for next steps, or do we have any more? I think we've hit them all. Okay, I think sort of what's happening next as Sara mentioned at the beginning of this, we know this is just kind of the first step of the enacted 25-26 budget. So what can we expect as we move closer to that? We've got some of the next steps listed for you here on this slide. The budget and the subcommittee hearings will be occurring through June. As we mentioned earlier, we expect the trailer bill language will be released on February 1st. The fabulous government relations team will read through that trailer bill and help analyze exactly what it means for us. So, be on the lookout for a news break from CASBO with all those important trailer bill details. Later in February, on the 21st, we have the deadline to introduce bills. It will then have the May revision sometime before that May 14th deadline. And that will include revenue updates and changes to proposed spending that I think Grant asked about if we had any idea what might change. But and I think Eric mentioned this earlier too, is it really is just heartbreaking for us to, see the devastation and the loss from the wildfires in Los Angeles, and we're keeping everyone impacted in our thoughts. The priority now is just to get control of the fires and to stop further losses, but we know that there will probably be some impacts to this May revision come that. So we're keeping our eye out for that. And the government relations team will send out another news break at that time. And we will also host another webinar to give you some updated information as well after May revise. So with that, I think we're officially at the end of our slides for this morning. Thank you all very much for joining us. We've listed our contact information on the slide. Again, I think we've mentioned if there were questions in the chat that we didn't get a chance to answer, please email your questions to the Gov Relations team email. I think it's at the top of the slides, and we'd